Imagine a kingdom, vast and powerful, brought to its knees not by an army, but by a single, mysterious woman. Her appearance was sudden, her age impossible to guess, and her demands audacious. She held 9 books, bound in what looked like ancient, sun-baked leather, each one radiating an inexplicable aura of power. These weren't just any books, she claimed they held the very destiny of Rome. The king, Tarquinius Superbus, a man accustomed to absolute authority, scoffed at her initial offer. 9 books, for a price that seemed absurdly high, he dismissed her, a quiet wave of his hand sealing what he thought was the end of the strange encounter. But the woman merely smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes that sent a shiver down the spine of even the most hardened guards. She vanished, only to reappear moments later, having burned 3 of the precious volumes. Her price for the remaining 6, she announced, was precisely the same as her original demand for all 9. Tarquinius was bewildered, his advisors' faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Was this a test, a demonstration of power? Again he hesitated, his pride battling with a burgeoning sense of dread. The woman, with unnerving patience, repeated her performance. 3 more books crackled into ash, their secrets dissolving into smoke, yet her price remained unyielding for the final trio. Why did this mysterious woman hold such sway, and what secrets were contained within the books that justified such an outrageous price, prompting us to ask why only priests were allowed to gaze upon them? The remaining 3 books were finally purchased, but at a cost that humbled even the arrogant Tarquinius. They were not for public consumption, nor for the casual glance of curious nobles. Their power, if the stories were true, was too immense, too volatile for untrained eyes. Thus, a sacred duty was established. Only a select college of priests, known as the Duodecimviri Sacris Faciundis, were granted the privilege, or perhaps the burden, of interpreting their cryptic verses. These weren't ordinary priests engaging in daily rituals. They were seers, scholars, and interpreters, chosen for their wisdom and discretion. They understood that the very act of reading these prophecies wasn't just an intellectual exercise, but a spiritual one, fraught with peril. The books, they believed, didn't just contain knowledge, they were knowledge, alive and potent. Access to these Sibylline books was restricted to moments of extreme national crisis. Plagues, famines, military defeats, or strange celestial phenomena. The Senate, in times of desperation, would formally request the priests to consult the ancient texts. This wasn't a request for simple answers, but for guidance, for rituals, for actions that could appease angry gods or avert impending doom. The weight of Rome's fate often rested on their shoulders as they grappled with obscure verses and tried to connect them to the terrifying realities unfolding around them. What kind of crises forced mighty Rome to seek such desperate counsel, making us wonder about the moments Rome stared into the abyss itself? Rome was not invincible, despite its burgeoning power and self-assured dominance. There were moments, etched into the very fabric of its history, when the city teetered on the brink of absolute annihilation, when the abyss seemed to open beneath its very foundations. These were the times when the ordinary rituals and political maneuverings proved utterly insufficient, and the desperate, collective gaze turned towards the ancient, enigmatic Sibylline books. Imagine the panic when the Gauls sacked Rome in 390 BC, burning much of the city to the ground. Or the chilling dread of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal, with his war elephants, ravaged the Italian countryside for years, constantly threatening the very gates of the capital. These were not mere setbacks, they were existential threats that shook the Roman world to its core. During such crises, the Senate would convene, their faces grim, their voices hushed, acknowledging that human solutions had failed. They would authorize the priests, the custodians of the Sibylline prophecies, to delve into the sacred texts. Every word, every cryptic instruction was scrutinized for a path forward, a ritual to perform, a god to appease. The stakes were impossibly high. The survival of the Republic, the lives of countless citizens, hung in the balance. It was in these moments of profound vulnerability, when the future seemed utterly opaque, that the enigmatic wisdom of the Sibyls became Rome's last, desperate hope, leaving us to ponder the very nature and origin of these mysterious figures known as the Sibyls. Who were these Sibyls, these prophetic women whose words held such sway over one of the world's greatest empires? The term Sibyl wasn't a name, but a title signifying a divine prophetess. There wasn't just one. Ancient tradition speaks of many Sibyls across the Greek and Roman world, each associated with a specific location. The Delphic Sibyl, the Erythraean Sibyl, the Samian Sibyl, and most famously, the Cumaean Sibyl, who resided near Naples. These women were revered and feared, seen as conduits for divine will, often speaking in ecstatic states. Their prophecies weren't neatly packaged predictions, they were obscure, poetic verses, often riddles that required deep interpretation. They were believed to be inspired by Apollo himself, their voices echoing the very breath of a god. The legend of the Cumaean Sibyl, the one who purportedly sold the books to Tarquinius Superbus, is particularly compelling. She was said to have lived for centuries, her body withered to almost nothing as granted by Apollo, yet her prophetic powers remained undiminished. It was her wisdom, collected and written down, that became the sacred texts of Rome. Her cave at Cumae was a place of pilgrimage, sought by those desperate for a glimpse into their destiny or the fate of nations. The idea that such profound, divinely inspired knowledge could be captured in human writing is astounding, prompting us to examine exactly what kind of prophecies Rome tried so desperately to forget. The Sibylline books weren't always a comforting oracle. Sometimes their prophecies were damning, unsettling, or directly contradicted the prevailing Roman worldview. Not every utterance was a grand solution or a divine instruction for victory. On occasion, they spoke of internal strife, the fall of leaders, or even the eventual demise of Rome itself. These were the prophecies Rome tried desperately to forget, or at least to reinterpret into something more palatable. Imagine a prophecy hinting at the destruction of a cherished temple or the rise of a foreign power that would ultimately conquer the city. Such pronouncements were seen as deeply threatening to the social and political order. The priest's role was not just to interpret, but sometimes to carefully manage the public perception of these prophecies to ensure they didn't incite panic or rebellion. There were instances where the prophecies guided Rome towards adopting foreign gods or rituals, a controversial act in a city proud of its native traditions. The introduction of the cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, for example, was a direct consequence of consulting the Sibylline books during a desperate moment in the Punic Wars. This wasn't an easy pill for the Romans to swallow. The very act of preserving these texts was a double-edged sword. While they offered guidance, they also contained knowledge that could be disruptive, even dangerous, if misunderstood or deliberately twisted. This brings us to a fascinating turn in history as we explore Christianity's uneasy inheritance of these very same prophetic traditions. As the Roman Empire slowly transformed and eventually embraced Christianity, the fate of the Sibylline books became a complex, contentious issue. For centuries, these pagan prophecies had been Rome's spiritual compass. Now, a new faith, monotheistic and fiercely exclusive, was ascendant. How could the ancient Sibyls, inspired by pagan gods, possibly fit into a Christian framework? Initially, Christian scholars found themselves in a peculiar dilemma. On one hand, they recognized the undeniable authority the Sibylline books held within the Roman psyche. To simply dismiss them seemed unwise. On the other hand, accepting them fully was to acknowledge a source of divine truth outside of Christian scripture, which was heretical. A compromise emerged, an uneasy inheritance that attempted to bridge the chasm. Early Christian writers began to selectively interpret, and even, some argue, interpolate new Sibylline oracles that predicted the coming of Christ, the virgin birth, and the end of the world. These texts became a tool for evangelism, demonstrating that even pagan seers foretold Christian truths. This appropriation was a testament to the book's enduring influence, but it also masked a deeper conflict within the nascent church. The question remained, could genuine prophecy come from outside the Abrahamic tradition? This internal struggle would eventually lead to a definitive answer as we investigate why the Church eventually banned them entirely. The uneasy truce between Christian theology and the pagan Sibylline books could not last forever. As Christianity solidified its dominance and became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the need to appropriate or reinterpret pagan prophecy waned. In fact, what was once a useful tool began to be seen as a dangerous relic, a source of potential heresy and continued pagan influence. The early appeals to the Sibyls by Christian apologists like Lactantius began to feel increasingly out of step with an emerging, stricter orthodoxy. The pagan origins of the prophecies became an undeniable problem. How could books supposedly inspired by Apollo, a pagan god, truly speak of the Christian God? The logical inconsistencies mounted. Furthermore, the very nature of pagan prophetesses, often depicted in ecstatic, almost wild states, was antithetical to the ordered, hierarchical structure of the Christian Church. There was a fear that the authentic Sibylline books, if truly pagan, might contain genuinely anti-Christian prophecies or lead believers astray. Thus, the official decree came. In the 5th century AD, General Flavius Stilicho, acting in the name of the Christianized Roman Empire, ordered the destruction of the original Sibylline books. They were publicly burned, a symbolic act severing Rome's lingering ties to its pagan past and decisively ending their role in imperial governance. This act raises a crucial question. What was lost in that fire, and what did these books truly represent at the crossroads of Greek and Roman divinity? The destruction of the Sibylline books marked a profound moment at the crossroads of Greek and Roman understanding of divinity. These texts were not just Roman, they were intrinsically linked to Greek prophetic traditions, embodying a fusion of cultural and spiritual beliefs that was unique in the ancient world. The Sibyls themselves were Greek figures, legendary prophetesses whose wisdom traveled across the Mediterranean. The Romans, ever pragmatic, had adopted and integrated these Greek prophecies, giving them a distinctly Roman purpose. To guide the state in times of crisis, they weren't just about personal fortune-telling, they were about the welfare of the Republic and later the Empire. This blend created a fascinating complex where Greek divine inspiration met Roman civic utility. The books reflected a polytheistic worldview, one where a myriad of gods and goddesses held sway over different aspects of life and destiny. The answers they provided often involved appeasing these diverse deities through specific rituals and sacrifices. This stood in stark contrast to the emerging monotheistic demands of Christianity. Their burning represented more than just the loss of ancient manuscripts. It symbolized the deliberate erasure of a syncretic spiritual heritage, a forceful shift from a world of many divine voices to one singular, absolute truth. Yet even in their absence, the Sibylline traditions retained a hidden influence over the empire, a force we must now trace. Even after their dramatic burning, the Sibylline tradition continued to exert a hidden, almost ghost-like influence over the empire. The very concept of a divine prophecy guiding the state, deeply embedded in the Roman psyche for centuries, did not simply vanish overnight. Oral traditions, fragmented texts, and the lingering memory of the Sibyls persisted. The desire for divine guidance, for a glimpse into the future during times of uncertainty, was too fundamental to human nature to be extinguished by a mere decree. While the official Sibylline books were gone, other prophetic texts, some claiming Sibylline authorship, continued to circulate, both within pagan circles and, perhaps surprisingly, among certain Christian communities. These later Sibylline oracles, often pseudepigraphical, attributed falsely to an ancient author, became powerful tools for ideological struggle. Christians used them to legitimize their faith by claiming pagan prophets foretold Christ. Pagans, in turn, might have used similar texts to criticize the decline of old traditions. The hidden influence lay in the enduring power of prophecy itself, the idea that fate could be divined and influenced. It showed that even when direct access to sacred texts was denied, the underlying spiritual need remained, twisting and adapting to new forms. This brings us to a pervasive element of ancient thought: symbolism without explanation, where meanings were deeply felt but rarely articulated directly. Ancient cultures, especially Rome, were steeped in symbolism, where objects, actions, and even words carried layers of meaning that were deeply understood but rarely explained directly. The Sibylline books themselves were prime examples of this phenomenon. Their prophecies weren't literal, straightforward predictions. They were dense with symbolic language, mythological allusions, and cryptic imagery that demanded interpretation. Imagine a prophecy speaking of a she-wolf nurturing twins or a fiery chariot descending from the sky. These weren't meant to be taken at face value. Instead, they required a deep knowledge of Roman mythology, an understanding of celestial phenomena, and an intuitive grasp of the divine language. The symbolism wasn't an embellishment, it was the prophecy itself. The priests who consulted the books didn't just read words, they deciphered meaning through a complex lens of cultural context, religious belief, and historical understanding. The very act of interpretation was a sacred art, a connection to a deeper, unseen reality. The power lay in the unspoken, the implied, the resonance of deep archetypes. This approach permeated Roman society, from the symbols on their coins to the architecture of their temples. Things were understood through their symbolic weight, rather than explicit definition. This lack of explicit explanation might seem frustrating to modern minds, but it was key to their power, hinting at a world where knowledge was both profound and elusive, leading us to consider the very nature of these books and the end of the world they often foretold. The Sibylline books, particularly in their later Greek and Latin iterations, were preoccupied with cataclysmic events and, crucially, the concept of the end of the world. These weren't just vague portents of misfortune. They often described cosmic shifts, widespread destruction, and ultimate judgment, reflecting a cyclical view of history common in ancient thought. While the original Roman Sibylline books focused on immediate national crises, the broader Sibylline tradition across the Greek and Roman world, especially as influenced by Eastern Mediterranean thought, contained vivid descriptions of plagues, famines, wars, and celestial anomalies that pointed towards a final reckoning. For both pagan and later Christian interpreters, these prophecies offered a framework for understanding chaos and suffering. If the world was destined to end or to undergo immense transformation, then current hardships could be seen as part of a larger, divinely ordained plan. This provided both dread and, paradoxically, a form of comfort or explanation. The imagery was often dramatic: stars falling from the sky, oceans boiling, mountains crumbling, and the arrival of a divine judge. These visions profoundly shaped ancient eschatology, the study of end times. They instilled a palpable sense of urgency and expectation, making us wonder how such ancient knowledge was assimilated through a pagan lens. The knowledge contained within the Sibylline books, both genuine and later forged, was always viewed through a distinctly pagan lens in its original context. This means it was interpreted within a worldview where multiple gods held sway, where fate was a powerful, often capricious force, and where the natural world was intimately connected to divine will. There was no single, all-powerful deity controlling everything. Prophecies about natural disasters, for instance, weren't seen as random occurrences. They were understood as signs of divine displeasure or as part of a larger, cyclical pattern overseen by various gods and goddesses. The solution wasn't prayer to one god, but specific rituals, sacrifices, and appeasement directed towards the offended deities. The ethical framework was also different. While concepts of justice and morality existed, they were often tied to civic duty, honor, and maintaining the favor of the gods, rather than a universal, divinely ordained moral code. The focus was on the collective good of the state and the perpetuation of its traditions. This pagan lens profoundly shaped the interpretation of the oracles, dictating what actions were taken and why. The answers were always within the framework of polytheism and Roman statecraft. This contrasts sharply with later Christian interpretations, making us ask about the curious case of the missing books that no one ever mentions. Beyond the famous 9 books allegedly sold to Tarquinius and burned by Stilicho, there's a whole collection of missing Sibylline books that rarely get mentioned in popular history. These are the numerous, often contradictory, Sibylline oracles that emerged over centuries, particularly from the 2nd century BC into the early Christian era. They weren't the officially sanctioned Roman state texts, but they carried the Sibylline name and authority. These later collections were composite works, a fascinating blend of Greek, Roman, Jewish, and Christian elements. Many were written by authors posing as ancient Sibyls, using the established prophetic figure to lend weight to their own religious or political messages. They offered their own versions of prophecy, history, and eschatology. For example, Jewish authors used Sibylline oracles to promote monotheism and critique paganism, while also predicting the coming of a Messiah. Christian authors, as mentioned earlier, adapted them to predict the incarnation of Christ and the Last Judgment, often seamlessly integrating biblical narratives with classical prophetic styles. These unofficial Sibylline texts were never formally housed in Roman temples, yet they circulated widely and influenced theological and philosophical thought for centuries. Their existence highlights a key point. Prophecy was a powerful medium, perpetually rewritten and repurposed, leaving us to wonder about this phenomenon of rewriting prophecy across the ages. The phenomenon of rewriting prophecy across ages is a testament to the enduring power and flexibility of prophetic texts, especially the Sibylline oracles. These were not static documents. They were living traditions, constantly adapted, reinterpreted, and sometimes outright forged to suit new historical circumstances, religious doctrines, or political agendas. In one era, a Sibylline text might warn against a specific foreign invasion, offering ritualistic solutions. Centuries later, that same prophecy, or a new one attributed to the same Sibyl, might be reinterpreted to refer to the coming of a new empire or even a different spiritual leader. The core message could remain, but its target and meaning drastically shifted. This constant rewriting allowed the prophecies to remain relevant and authoritative, even as societies and belief systems evolved. It ensured that the voice of the Sibyls, however distant, could still speak to contemporary concerns. It reflects a deep human need to find continuity and meaning in historical events, to see a divine hand guiding the chaos. This tradition of adapting prophecy wasn't seen as forgery in the same negative sense we understand it today. Instead, it was often viewed as a legitimate way of extending divine inspiration, making ancient wisdom accessible and applicable to a new generation. This practice raises a profound question: were the Sibylline books ever truly divine or merely human creations? The central question, perhaps the most profound of all, is whether the Sibylline books were ever truly divine. To the ancient Romans, especially those in positions of power, they absolutely were. They believed the Sibyls spoke with the voice of the gods, and their prophecies were direct expressions of divine will, albeit cryptic and difficult to interpret. The sheer cost and reverence given to them underscores this belief. However, from a modern, critical perspective, the situation is far more nuanced. The prophecies themselves were often vague enough to fit multiple situations, and the priestly interpretations undoubtedly shaped their meaning to serve the interests of the Roman state. Even the process of compiling and transcribing these oracles involved human hands, human choices, and human biases. Furthermore, the later proliferation of pseudo-Sibylline oracles, clearly written by human authors with specific agendas, muddies the waters considerably. If so many texts were later fabrications, how can we be sure the original core was authentically divine? The line between inspired utterance and clever rhetoric becomes increasingly blurred. Yet to deny any element of the divine is perhaps to miss the point for the Romans themselves. Their belief made them divine, giving them real-world power and influence. Regardless of their true origin, their impact was undeniable. This enduring mystery is precisely why we're still searching for answers even today. We are still searching for the answers embedded within the Sibylline tradition, even millennia after the physical destruction of the original books. Our search isn't just about uncovering lost texts, it's about understanding the very human impulse to seek meaning, guidance, and foresight in an uncertain world. The Sibylline books represent a powerful archetype, the voice of ancient wisdom guiding humanity through crisis. We are searching to understand the complex interplay between religion, politics, and power in the ancient world. How did these books shape Roman decisions? How did Christian reinterpretations influence the spread of a new faith? These are questions that resonate through history and help us decode the foundations of Western civilization. Furthermore, the Sibylline oracles, both authentic and apocryphal, offer a window into ancient eschatological thought, how different cultures grappled with the concept of the end of time and humanity's ultimate destiny. This remains a deeply compelling human concern, whether through religious prophecy, scientific predictions, or philosophical inquiry. The very act of their destruction, an attempt to erase a powerful pagan tradition, paradoxically enshrined their importance. What was so dangerous about them that they had to be obliterated? That unanswered question continues to fuel our fascination, ensuring that the whisper of the Sibyls will echo through time, always prompting further investigation into similar ancient mysteries.